Maybe next time, dress for the wedding you belong at. The words floated through the ballroom just seconds before the sound that followed silenced nearly 300 guests. A sharp tear cut through the music. Not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Conversations stopped. Crystal glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the string quartet near the marble staircase missed a note. Ariel Vaughn looked down. A long section of fabric along the side of her elegant midnight blue dress hung loose where it had just torn. For a moment nobody moved. The grand ballroom of the Seabrook Resort shimmered beneath towering chandeliers imported from Italy. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, where moonlight danced across dark waves nearly 200 feet below the cliffs. Everything about the evening was designed to communicate perfection. White roses lined the walls. Silver candlelight flickered across polished marble floors. Luxury and status surrounded every corner. At the center of it all stood Savannah Mercer, the bride. Her designer gown sparkled beneath the lights. Her smile remained firmly in place, though satisfaction flickered briefly behind her eyes. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to notice what had happened. A few quietly smiled into their champagne glasses. Ariel slowly lifted her gaze. Her expression remained calm. No anger. No embarrassment. No scene. Just a steady composure that somehow made the silence even heavier. Savannah tilted her head. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "What happened?" A few nervous laughs scattered through the room. Ariel looked at the torn fabric again before gently smoothing the edge with her hand. "Fabric tears," she said softly. Savannah's smile tightened. She had expected something else. An argument. A reaction. A reason to feel justified. Instead, the woman standing before her seemed almost untouched by the humiliation. Across the ballroom, Grant Holloway turned away from a group of investors after noticing the crowd gathering near the center of the room. Tall, confident, and widely respected throughout the business world, he had spent most of the evening greeting guests and thanking supporters. He frowned slightly as he began making his way through the crowd. He had not seen what happened, only the aftermath, only the unusual silence spreading across his wedding reception. Ariel noticed him approaching but said nothing. She simply stepped aside, giving space back to the celebration that was supposed to belong to him and Savannah. Yet even as conversation slowly resumed, curious eyes continued following her. She was not part of the bride's social circle. She was not family. She had arrived alone. She wore no visible symbols of wealth despite carrying herself with unusual confidence. Throughout the evening, people had quietly wondered why she had been invited at all. Several guests assumed she worked with one of the event planners. Others guessed she might be connected to hotel management. Nobody seemed to know. And the few who had asked received only polite answers. Ariel never volunteered information. Never explained herself. Never corrected assumptions. Near the back of the room, an elderly woman paused midway through lifting a glass of sparkling water. Her eyes narrowed. She stared directly at Ariel as if trying to place a familiar face from many years ago. Something about the woman in the blue dress seemed impossible to ignore. But before the elderly guest could move closer, another wave of music filled the ballroom as staff attempted to restore the evening's atmosphere. Savannah accepted congratulations from nearby friends. Grant returned to greeting investors. The celebration continued, at least on the surface. Yet beneath the golden light, beneath the laughter and expensive suits, a question now lingered quietly through the room. Who exactly was Ariel Vaughn? And why did the woman who had just been humiliated look more composed than anyone else in the building? Ariel Vaughn moved away from the center of the ballroom before anyone could offer sympathy she did not want. The torn section of her dress brushed softly against the polished marble floor as she crossed the room beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Around her, conversations cautiously restarted. Laughter returned in small bursts. The string quartet resumed playing as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet the atmosphere remained different. People were watching. Not openly. Not rudely. But enough for Ariel to feel their curiosity following her through the crowd. She stepped toward a quieter section near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Outside, moonlight stretched across the dark water like silver paint. The waves rolled steadily against the cliffs below the resort, indifferent to status, wealth, or embarrassment. Ariel appreciated that. Nature never cared about social hierarchies. She set her small evening purse on a nearby table and calmly adjusted the damaged fabric. A young server approached. "Ma'am, would you like me to find someone to help with that?" Ariel smiled warmly. "Thank you, but I will be fine." The young man nodded and moved on. Across the ballroom, Savannah Mercer was surrounded by friends who seemed eager to reassure her that nothing inappropriate had occurred. Several women complimented her wedding dress. Others laughed at stories from earlier in the day. Savannah smiled easily, though from time to time her eyes drifted toward Ariel. Something about the lack of reaction seemed to bother her. It was not the response she had expected. Meanwhile, Grant Holloway continued greeting guests near the dance floor. Investors, business partners, former colleagues, and family friends all wanted a moment of his attention. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, smiled for photographs. Yet every few minutes his gaze shifted toward the woman standing quietly by the windows. He did not understand why. Something felt unresolved. Near the back of the room, the elderly woman who had noticed Ariel earlier remained seated at a table covered in white roses. Eleanor Price had spent more than 4 decades in finance. She had advised banks, corporations, and investment funds long before most of the people in the ballroom ever opened their first brokerage account. Her memory remained sharp. Her instincts even sharper. She watched Ariel carefully. The posture, the composure, the face. Every passing minute strengthened a growing suspicion. Finally, Eleanor rose from her chair and began walking across the ballroom. But before she reached Ariel, another guest stopped her. Then another. Then another. Conversations delayed her progress each time. By the time she finally looked up again, Ariel had stepped outside onto the ocean terrace. Cool coastal air greeted her immediately. The sounds of the reception faded behind the closed glass doors. String lights stretched across the terrace railings, reflecting softly against the dark ocean below. Ariel rested her hands lightly on the stone balustrade and allowed herself a long breath. For the first time all evening she was alone. Or so she thought. Behind the glass doors, several guests continued watching her. Questions spread quietly through the reception. Who invited her? How did she know Grant? Why did she seem completely unaffected by what had happened? Nobody had answers. Not yet. Inside the ballroom, Eleanor Price finally reached the terrace entrance and stopped. Through the glass she stared at Ariel beneath the string lights. Her eyes widened slightly. Then a memory surfaced. A boardroom. A financial crisis. A young investor. A signature that had changed everything. Eleanor's heart skipped. Because if she was right, the woman standing alone outside was not simply another wedding guest. And the people inside that ballroom had absolutely no idea who they had just humiliated. Eleanor Price remained near the terrace doors long after the memory surfaced. The ballroom behind her sparkled with wealth and celebration, but for the first time that evening she barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on Ariel Vaughn. Outside, the woman stood alone beneath strands of warm white light swaying gently in the ocean breeze. The damaged section of her dress moved softly against the stone terrace floor. Yet somehow the torn fabric made her appear more dignified, not less. Eleanor had seen that kind of composure before. Not at weddings. In boardrooms. During negotiations. In moments when fortunes rose or fell based on a single decision. Slowly, Eleanor stepped through the glass doors onto the terrace. The sound of the ocean grew louder immediately. Ariel turned at the faint click of the door. For a moment, both women simply looked at one another. Then Eleanor smiled. "I knew I recognized you." Ariel's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Price." Eleanor laughed quietly. "It has been a long time since anyone called me that." Moonlight reflected across the water behind them. "Almost 11 years," Ariel replied. Eleanor nodded. 11 years and somehow you look exactly the same." Ariel smiled. "That is generous." Eleanor stepped closer. Her eyes moved briefly to the torn section of the dress before returning to Ariel's face. "You handled that far better than most people would have." Ariel looked toward the ocean. There was nothing to gain from making things worse. Eleanor studied her carefully. The answer sounded exactly like the woman she remembered. Years ago, when half the financial community had been chasing publicity and recognition, Ariel had always chosen the opposite path. Quiet work, quiet results, quiet influence. Eleanor folded her hands. Does Grant know you are here? Ariel hesitated. He knows I was invited. That is not what I asked. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Ariel's mouth. No. Eleanor exhaled slowly. She had suspected as much. Inside the ballroom, laughter drifted through the glass before fading again beneath the sound of the waves. He still does not know? Eleanor asked. Ariel shook her head. I never saw a reason to tell him. Eleanor stared at her in disbelief. Ariel, that company would not exist without you. Ariel remained silent. Her eyes stayed on the dark horizon stretching beyond the cliffs. Many people helped, she said quietly. Eleanor almost laughed. No. Many people arrived after the hard part. The older woman's voice carried no anger, only certainty. I was there. I saw what happened. Ariel lowered her gaze. Memories flickered briefly across her face. Small office spaces, overdue bills, investors walking away, long nights filled with impossible decisions. Grant had been younger then, ambitious, determined, desperate. Most people saw risk. Ariel saw potential. Eleanor remembered every detail. Before either woman could continue, movement inside the ballroom caught Eleanor's attention. Savannah stood with several guests near the dance floor. She appeared relaxed now, confident that the awkward moment from earlier had passed. Not far away, Grant continued greeting investors. Neither of them noticed the conversation taking place outside. Eleanor looked back at Ariel. This evening is heading toward a very interesting ending. Ariel smiled faintly. I hope not. Eleanor shook her head. I think you underestimate how shocking the truth can be. Through the glass walls of the ballroom, the celebration continued beneath crystal chandeliers and expensive smiles. Yet standing on the terrace beneath the moonlight, Eleanor knew something none of those guests knew. The woman they viewed as an outsider had once played a role in one of the most important turning points of Grant Holloway's life. And sooner or later, someone inside that ballroom was going to discover it. The terrace conversation ended when a member of the wedding staff stepped through the glass doors carrying a silver tray of champagne. The young employee paused for a moment, clearly recognizing Eleanor Price, then politely informed her that Grant was about to begin a special toast inside the ballroom. Eleanor thanked him and glanced toward Ariel. Looks like the evening is moving into its next chapter. Ariel smiled politely. Then we should probably return before people start wondering where we disappeared to. Together they walked back into the reception. Warm golden light immediately replaced the cool ocean air. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Music softened as guests gradually gathered around the main dance floor. The ballroom once again looked exactly as it had been designed to look. Perfect. Elegant. Effortless. Yet beneath the surface, subtle currents had begun moving in directions nobody seemed to notice. Grant Holloway stepped onto a small stage near the center of the room. Applause spread through the crowd. Investors, relatives, longtime friends, and business associates turned toward him with smiling faces. Savannah joined him moments later, radiant beneath the lights as cameras flashed from every corner of the ballroom. Ariel quietly took a place near the back of the room. Eleanor remained beside her. Neither spoke. Grant lifted a glass and began thanking everyone for attending. His voice carried naturally through the room. He thanked family. He thanked friends. He thanked mentors who had supported him throughout his career. Guests nodded along. Laughter occasionally rippled through the audience as he shared stories from his younger years. Savannah stood beside him, smiling proudly. Then Grant began speaking about success, about opportunity, about the people who believed in him when few others did. Something about the words caused Eleanor's expression to change. She folded her arms and looked toward Ariel. Ariel remained focused on the stage. Calm, composed, as if she were listening to a story she had already heard. You see, Eleanor whispered. He still does not know. Ariel did not answer. On stage, Grant continued describing difficult years early in his career. Small office spaces, uncertain investments, long nights spent wondering if his company would survive. The crowd listened attentively. Many knew the successful version of Grant Holloway. Few knew the struggling entrepreneur he had once been. There were moments, Grant said, when I honestly believed everything was about to fall apart. Several guests nodded knowingly. He smiled. Fortunately, good people appeared at the right time. More applause followed. Savannah squeezed his hand affectionately. The audience loved the speech. Eleanor looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, she leaned closer to Ariel. He is standing 10 feet away from the person he should be thanking. Ariel exhaled softly. Please do not. Eleanor turned toward her. Why? Ariel glanced around the ballroom. Wealthy guests filled every table. Investors discussed future deals between courses. Friends laughed beside elaborate floral arrangements. The wedding remained beautiful despite the tension lingering beneath it. Because tonight belongs to them, Ariel said quietly. Not me. Eleanor stared at her for several seconds. Then she shook her head in disbelief. Before she could respond, a group of guests approached Savannah near the stage. One of them complimented her wedding dress. Another jokingly mentioned the earlier incident involving Ariel. Several people laughed. Savannah smiled. The conversation appeared harmless to most of the room. Yet Ariel noticed Eleanor's reaction immediately. The older woman's expression hardened. Years of patience seemed to vanish all at once. Across the ballroom, Grant continued thanking supporters while completely unaware of what was unfolding nearby. Eleanor slowly set down her glass. Her eyes moved from Savannah to Ariel and back again. Then she made a decision. Without saying another word, she stepped away from the table and began walking directly toward the stage. And for the first time that evening, Ariel felt a small sense of concern. Eleanor Price moved through the crowd with a determination that immediately drew attention. Guests stepped aside instinctively. Some recognized her as a respected figure from the financial world. Others simply sensed that something important was about to happen. On stage, Grant Holloway had just finished thanking a group of early supporters when he noticed Eleanor approaching. His expression brightened. "Mrs. Price," he said warmly, "I did not expect you to make the trip." Light applause greeted her arrival near the stage. Eleanor smiled politely but did not stop walking. The ballroom slowly grew quieter. Savannah noticed the shift and turned toward the older woman. "Everyone," Grant continued, lifting his microphone slightly, "this is Eleanor Price, one of the smartest people I have ever had the privilege of learning from." More applause followed. Eleanor accepted the compliment with a small nod. Then she looked directly at Grant. "That is very kind," she said. "But tonight I think there is someone else who deserves recognition." The room immediately became still. Guests exchanged curious glances. Grant laughed lightly. "I am sure there are many people." Eleanor's eyes moved toward the back of the ballroom. Toward Ariel. "No," she said quietly. "Just one." Several heads turned in the same direction. Ariel immediately lowered her gaze. She already knew where this was heading. Savannah followed the movement of the crowd's attention and frowned slightly when she realized who Eleanor was looking at. The bride's expression hardened. Grant looked confused. "I am not sure I understand." Eleanor took another step forward. The chandeliers reflected across hundreds of glasses and polished silver decorations as every conversation in the ballroom faded away. "You spent part of your speech talking about the difficult years," Eleanor said. "The years when your company almost failed." Grant nodded. "Yes. You spoke about the people who believed in you." "I did." Eleanor smiled gently. "Then perhaps you should tell everyone about the investor who kept the company alive." A ripple of curiosity spread across the audience. Grant looked genuinely puzzled now. "The investor?" Eleanor nodded. "The one who provided the capital when everyone else walked away." Savannah folded her arms. Several investors leaned closer. Cameras that had been used for wedding photographs slowly turned toward the stage. Grant hesitated. The funding came from a private source through an intermediary structure. Eleanor's smile widened slightly. "Exactly." Silence settled across the room. Ariel closed her eyes briefly. She had hoped this conversation would never happen. "Very few people knew the identity behind that investment," Grant continued. "Even I did not know for years." Eleanor looked directly at him. And apparently you still do not. A murmur moved through the crowd. Savannah glanced from Grant to Eleanor, clearly irritated by the direction of the conversation. What exactly are you trying to say? She asked. Eleanor finally turned toward her. I am saying that the woman standing at the back of this ballroom deserves far more respect than she has received tonight. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Guests immediately looked toward Ariel again. Some recognized her as the woman from the earlier incident. Others remembered the torn dress. Others remembered laughing. Grant followed their gaze. His confusion deepened. Ariel? He asked. Eleanor nodded. Slowly. Deliberately. Yes, Grant. The older woman's voice softened. Ariel Vaughn. The ballroom remained completely silent. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Outside the windows, moonlight shimmered across the Atlantic Ocean. Inside, 300 people waited for Eleanor's next words. And standing alone near the back of the room, Ariel realized the secret she had protected for more than a decade was finally about to become impossible to hide. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The ballroom seemed suspended in time. The chandeliers continued glowing above the crowd. Candlelight flickered across crystal glasses. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlantic Ocean rolled steadily beneath the moonlit sky. Yet inside the room, everything had become perfectly still. Grant Holloway stared toward the back of the ballroom. Ariel Vaughn stood exactly where she had been moments earlier, one hand resting lightly against the back of an empty chair. The torn section of her midnight blue dress remained visible beneath the warm light. She looked neither nervous nor angry. If anything, she appeared tired. Eleanor Price stepped closer to the microphone. 11 years ago, she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the silence, Grant's company was weeks away from shutting its doors. Several investors exchanged surprised glances. Grant never spoke publicly about those years. Banks declined additional financing, Eleanor continued. Investors pulled out. Vendors stopped extending favorable terms. Most people believed the company would not survive. The room remained silent. Savannah's expression slowly shifted from irritation to uncertainty. Eleanor looked directly at Grant. Do you remember the emergency meeting in Chicago? Grant nodded automatically. Of course. Do you remember the investor who appeared through a private intermediary and provided the funding package that kept the company alive? Grant hesitated. I remember the investment. Eleanor smiled softly. Then you remember the day your future changed. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. He did remember. Every detail. The fear. The uncertainty. The relief when funding suddenly appeared after every other door had closed. For years he had assumed the capital came from a large institutional source, operating behind layers of confidentiality agreements. Eleanor slowly turned toward Ariel. 300 people followed her gaze. It was her. The words settled across the ballroom like a wave. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Grant stared at Ariel. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Then disbelief gave way to realization. Fragments of old conversations surfaced in his memory. References he had never fully understood. Meetings canceled without explanation. Confidential agreements that had always seemed unusually protective of investor privacy. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. Savannah looked from Eleanor to Ariel and back again. That is impossible, she whispered. Eleanor calmly shook her head. No. What is impossible is how long she kept it secret. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Several guests who had laughed earlier now looked away. Others stared at Ariel as if seeing her for the first time. Grant slowly stepped off the stage. The microphone remained forgotten in his hand. His eyes never left Ariel. Why? He asked quietly. The question carried through the room despite his low voice. Ariel looked down briefly before answering. Because you needed help. Grant blinked. That was all. A faint smile appeared on her face. Was there supposed to be another reason? The simplicity of the answer seemed to affect him more than any dramatic speech could have. Around them, guests stood motionless beneath the chandeliers. Savannah lowered her eyes. For the first time all evening, she appeared unable to find words. Eleanor watched quietly from the stage. She knew the numbers involved. She knew the risk Ariel had accepted all those years ago. She also knew that Ariel had never demanded credit, influence, publicity, or repayment beyond what had been contractually agreed. She had simply helped when help was needed. Grant looked around the ballroom. He saw investors, executives, friends, family. Then his eyes returned to the woman standing alone near the back of the room. The woman many people had dismissed within minutes of meeting her. The woman whose dress had been torn. The woman who had remained calm through every insult. And standing there beneath the warm glow of the reception lights, Grant Holloway finally understood that the most important person in the story of his success had been quietly standing in front of him all night. Grant remained where he stood for several moments, the microphone hanging loosely at his side. Around him the ballroom seemed transformed. The same guests, the same chandeliers, the same flowers, yet nothing looked quite the same anymore. Conversations had disappeared completely. Investors who normally analyzed numbers now studied faces. Friends who had arrived expecting celebration now found themselves witnessing something far more memorable. Ariel Vaughn remained near the back of the room, calm beneath the attention she had spent more than a decade avoiding. Savannah Mercer stood on the stage, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The confidence that had defined her throughout the evening was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Grant slowly walked across the ballroom. Every step seemed louder than it should have. Guests moved aside without being asked. No one wanted to interrupt the moment unfolding before them. When he finally reached Ariel, neither spoke immediately. The distance between them was only a few feet. Yet it felt as though 11 years stood there too. 11 years of unanswered questions. 11 years of assumptions. 11 years of a secret that had shaped his entire future. "You saved the company," Grant finally said. Ariel shook her head gently. "No." Her voice remained soft. "The company survived because people worked hard." Grant stared at her. Without that investment, there would not have been a company. Ariel smiled faintly. Maybe. The answer somehow made the room even quieter. Grant looked down briefly before lifting his eyes again. "Why never tell me?" Ariel glanced around the ballroom. Investors stood frozen near their tables. Wedding guests watched from beneath crystal light. Savannah remained motionless on the stage. "Because it was never about being known," Ariel answered. "It was about helping when someone needed help." The simplicity of the statement settled over the crowd. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others looked toward Savannah. Earlier in the evening, many of them had quietly participated in assumptions about Ariel. Some had laughed. Some had watched without speaking. None of them looked comfortable now. Eleanor Price stepped down from the stage and joined the crowd. "That was always her way," she said. "Even back then." Grant nodded slowly. Memories continued surfacing. Small details that suddenly made sense. Anonymous recommendations. Quiet support during critical moments. Advice that had somehow arrived exactly when needed. He had spent years believing luck played a role in his success. Tonight he was learning another truth. Across the ballroom, Savannah finally stepped down from the stage. The movement drew attention immediately. The room parted as she approached. Unlike earlier, she carried none of the certainty that had surrounded her. When she stopped in front of Ariel, the silence became absolute. Even the wedding staff seemed frozen in place. Savannah looked at the damaged section of Ariel's dress. Then she looked at Ariel herself. For several seconds she struggled to find words. She began before stopping. Emotion and embarrassment seemed to collide at once. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Ariel said nothing. Savannah lowered her gaze. "And I was wrong." The admission hung in the air. Honest. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Grant watched quietly. Eleanor watched too. So did every person in the ballroom. Ariel looked at Savannah for a moment before offering a small smile. Not a victorious smile. Not a forgiving smile delivered for applause. Just simple kindness. The kind that asked for nothing in return. Outside the windows, moonlight continued shimmering across the Atlantic Ocean. Inside, beneath thousands of pieces of crystal reflecting warm golden light, the story of the evening had changed completely. What began as a celebration of wealth and status had become something else. A lesson. And every person in the room knew they were witnessing it. For a long moment after Savannah's apology, nobody in the ballroom seemed eager to speak. The silence was not uncomfortable anymore. It was reflective. The kind of silence that follows the discovery of something important. Crystal chandeliers continued casting warm light across the marble floors. White roses filled the room with a subtle fragrance. Beyond the towering windows, waves rolled steadily against the cliffs below the resort. Life continued. Yet everyone inside the ballroom felt different than they had an hour earlier. Savannah stood before Ariel with her eyes lowered. She was no longer thinking about appearances, photographs, or the perfect wedding reception she had spent months planning. She was thinking about the woman standing in front of her. A woman she had dismissed within seconds of meeting. A woman she had judged without understanding. Ariel gently adjusted the damaged section of her dress. The motion drew Savannah's attention immediately. Regret crossed her face. "I wish I could take back what happened," Savannah said quietly. Ariel looked at her for a moment before answering. "We all have moments we wish we could revisit." The response carried no bitterness. No accusation. If anything, it sounded compassionate. Savannah seemed surprised by that. Grant stood nearby, listening carefully. Throughout his career, he had negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars. He had managed difficult partnerships and complicated business relationships. Yet watching Ariel handle this moment with grace felt more impressive than any deal he had ever closed. Eleanor Price smiled softly from a nearby table. She recognized what was happening. Respect was replacing assumption. Understanding was replacing judgment. Around the ballroom, guests slowly began returning to their seats, though their attention remained fixed on the small group at the center of the room. Nobody wanted to miss another word. Grant finally stepped forward. "There is something everyone here should know." His voice carried through the ballroom without needing a microphone. Conversations immediately stopped again. He looked around the room. Investors, friends, family members, business leaders. Then his eyes returned to Ariel. "For years, I believed success was something I built myself." He paused. "Tonight reminded me that no one succeeds alone." The statement seemed to resonate with many of the guests. Several nodded quietly. Others lowered their eyes. Grant continued. "Some people help because they expect recognition. Some help because they expect influence. And some help because it is the right thing to do." He smiled toward Ariel. "The last kind is the rarest." The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Not social applause. Genuine applause. It filled the room beneath the chandeliers and echoed softly against the glass walls overlooking the ocean. Ariel looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. She had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of moment. Savannah wiped away a tear before quickly composing herself. Eleanor laughed quietly. That reaction is probably making her more nervous than the investment ever did. Several nearby guests smiled. The tension that had dominated the evening finally began to dissolve. Yet something deeper remained. A lesson nobody would forget. As the applause gradually faded, Grant reached for a fresh glass of sparkling cider from a passing server. He raised it toward Ariel. One by one, guests throughout the ballroom did the same. Hundreds of glasses lifted beneath the golden light. Not in celebration of money, not in celebration of power, but in recognition of character. Ariel looked around the room and saw faces that now viewed her differently than they had when the evening began. Some looked embarrassed, some grateful, some thoughtful. But for the first time all night, every single one of them saw her clearly. And standing beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers with the Atlantic Ocean shimmering beyond the windows, Ariel realized that sometimes the strongest response to humiliation was not revenge. Sometimes it was simply remaining true to who you are. The reception slowly returned to life, but it never returned to what it had been before. The music resumed. Conversations restarted. Guests drifted back toward their tables beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet something fundamental had changed. The evening had begun as a celebration of success, status, and appearances. It was ending as something entirely different. Hours later, the ballroom had thinned considerably. Investors departed for private flights. Relatives exchanged final hugs near the entrance. Hotel staff quietly cleared tables decorated with white roses and silver candle holders. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean continued its endless rhythm against the cliffs below the resort. Ariel Vaughn stood alone near the terrace doors once more. The damaged section of her dress remained visible, though she no longer seemed aware of it. Cool moonlight spilled across the stone terrace beyond the glass. She stepped outside and breathed in the ocean air. The night felt peaceful now. Behind her, the sounds of the reception faded into a distant hum. Footsteps approached. Ariel turned and saw Grant Holloway walking toward her. This time there were no guests watching, no investors listening, no audience waiting for a dramatic moment. Just two people standing beneath the stars. Grant stopped beside her at the stone railing overlooking the water. For a while neither spoke. They simply watched the moonlight shimmer across the waves. Finally Grant smiled softly. "I spent years wondering who that investor was." Ariel laughed quietly. "I know. You knew." "Of course." Grant shook his head. "And you never once hinted at it." Ariel looked toward the horizon. The company survived. That was what mattered. Grant studied her for a moment. "Most people would have wanted recognition. Maybe. Most people would have reminded me every year." Ariel smiled. "That sounds exhausting." Grant laughed for the first time all evening. The sound carried lightly into the ocean breeze. Then his expression grew serious again. "Thank you." Ariel turned toward him. The words were simple, honest, free of business language or public performance. Grant continued. "Not just for the investment, for believing in something when nobody else did." Ariel looked back toward the water. "You gave people a reason to believe." Behind them, the ballroom doors opened briefly. Warm golden light spilled onto the terrace before fading again. Savannah stepped outside. She approached slowly, stopping several feet away. Her wedding gown moved gently in the breeze. "I wanted to say one more thing," she said quietly. Ariel looked at her. Savannah lowered her eyes. "I hope one day you remember tonight for something other than my mistake." Ariel considered the words. Then she smiled. "People are more than their worst moment." Savannah's eyes glistened slightly. She nodded. No further explanation was necessary. The three stood together for a moment beneath the moonlit sky. Then Ariel glanced toward the path leading away from the resort. "I should go." Grant nodded. Savannah nodded too. Neither tried to stop her. Ariel walked down the stone pathway lined with lanterns. The ocean breeze moved gently through the coastal grass. Behind her, the resort glowed warmly against the darkness. Ahead, the road disappeared into the night. At the gate she paused briefly and looked back one final time. Grant and Savannah still stood on the terrace, smaller now beneath the lights of the resort. They raised a hand. Ariel returned the gesture before turning away. The sound of the waves followed her as she walked into the darkness beyond the property. No applause accompanied her departure. No cameras recorded the moment. No headlines would ever capture it. Yet everyone who attended that wedding would remember what happened there. Not because of wealth, not because of influence, but because a woman who had every reason to demand recognition chose grace instead. And as the moonlight stretched across the Atlantic and the resort lights faded behind her, the quiet dignity of that choice remained long after the celebration ended.